Greetings, friends of the wild trails. I am Leonard, 55 years old, an American explorer who has spent more than half my life wandering across the continents. These feet have tread upon the burning sands of the Sahara, carved paths through the deep Amazon, and tasted the biting cold of Antarctica. But there is one story that still sends shivers down my spine every time I recall it. The history of exploration is not only paved with glory. Sometimes it is a tragedy written in tears and bodies buried beneath the frozen snow.
Today, beside this quiet campfire, I will take you up the sacred Chomolungma, Mount Everest. We will revisit the horrifying disaster of 1996, a moment when human ambition and pride were ruthlessly shattered by Mother Nature. At an altitude of over 8,000 meters, where the death zone suffocates every breath, all veneers of civilization strip away, leaving only the extreme struggle between the primal instinct to survive, absolute terror, and moments of heartbreaking heroic sacrifice. Before we step into that nightmarish blizzard together, let this old man know. Where in the world are you sitting by your own fire listening to this story? Drop a comment below, and if you cherish the call of the wild, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to continue journeying with me on the adventures ahead. Now, pull your warm collar up high, because the bitter winds on the roof of the world are starting to howl.
The air in Kathmandu was thick, choking with the exhaust of two-stroke engines and the sweet, heavy scent of burning temple incense. Pre-monsoon clouds hovered like bruised plums over the chaotic brick-red city, a stark, sweltering contrast to the biting, crystalline cold that awaited high above. We were leaving the realm of the living to step into the domain of Chomolungma, the mother goddess of the earth. You were standing at Everest Base Camp, an elevation of 17,600 feet, where the air contains only half the oxygen you are used to breathing. It is not a place of serene, untouched wilderness, but rather a sprawling, chaotic village of brightly colored nylon domes pitched on the shifting, groaning ice of the Khumbu Glacier. This is the staging ground for the greatest physical challenge on Earth, and in the spring of 1996, it closely resembled a high-altitude circus.
The man observing all of this with a critical, increasingly anxious eye was John Krakauer. At 42 years old, Krakauer was a wiry, lean man with intense, observant eyes and a deeply analytical mind. He was a seasoned climber in his younger years, having conquered formidable peaks in Alaska and Patagonia, but extreme high-altitude mountaineering was an entirely different beast, one he had not wrestled with for years. Sent by Outside Magazine, his assignment was clear: report on the growing, controversial commercialization of Mount Everest. Krakauer harbored a lifelong, almost mythic aspiration to stand on the roof of the world, a childhood dream rekindled by the magazine's backing. Yet, as a journalist, he was tasked with providing an objective perspective on a disturbing trend: wealthy amateurs paying a staggering $65,000 to be literally guided and sometimes dragged to the summit. Krakauer was embedded within the Adventure Consultants expedition, led by the legendary New Zealand climber, Rob Hall. Hall was 35, standing an imposing 6 feet 3 inches tall, yet painfully lanky, lacking an ounce of excess fat. He sported a neatly trimmed beard and possessed a calm, deeply reassuring demeanor. Hall was meticulous, organized to a fault, and took the responsibility of his clients' lives with a profound, almost crushing seriousness. He was driven by a flawless guiding record, having successfully put 39 clients on the summit in just 5 years. He was the safe bet, the careful shepherd of the mountain. But Hall was not alone on the mountain. The commercial competition was fierce. Pitched right next door was the Mountain Madness Camp, led by the charismatic and rugged Scott Fisher. At 40 years old, Fisher was a striking figure with a blonde ponytail, a muscular build, and boundless nervous energy. Unlike Hall's tight micromanagement, Fisher was a free spirit, operating on a let the chips fall where they may philosophy. He was famously tough, a man who once climbed with a rotting hole in his leg, and his magnetic personality drew clients who sought a more rebellious brand of adventure. The rivalry between Hall and Fisher was unspoken, but palpable. Both needed to get their clients to the top to secure future business. This intense competition created a hurried, pressured atmosphere. As Krakauer observed the inhabitants of base camp, the conflict between ambition and reality became glaringly obvious. Many of the clients lacked the fundamental experience required to survive in the death zone above 26,000 feet. They were not hardened alpinists. They were doctors, lawyers, and socialites. Take Sandy Hill Pittman, for example, a high-profile client in Fisher's camp. Pittman was a striking, wealthy New York socialite and media personality. Even in the harsh, freezing environment of base camp, she maintained a well-groomed appearance. Driven intensely by social status and the desire to become the first American woman to complete the 7 summits, Pittman represented the absolute zenith of Everest's commercialization. She brought an astonishing array of luxury items to the glacier, including a heavy espresso machine, gourmet food, and complex satellite communication equipment, all of which required the immense, exhausting labor of local Sherpas to haul up the mountain. In sharp contrast stood Doug Hansen, a client in Rob Hall's group. Hansen was 46, a lean, weathered postal worker from Seattle with a gentle, humble personality. He was not wealthy. He had worked night and day, taking on construction jobs to scrape together the $65,000 fee. This was Hansen's second attempt. The previous year, Hall had forced him to turn back just 330 feet from the summit due to the turnaround time. Now, Hansen carried the heavy emotional weight of his past failure, along with a flag given to him by the elementary school students who had sold T-shirts to help fund his climb. His desperation to succeed was quiet, but absolute. As the weeks ticked by, the acclimatization process began. The teams were forced to climb up and down through the terrifying Khumbu Icefall, a treacherous, moving river of ice featuring seracs the size of office buildings and bottomless crevasses crossed only by rickety aluminum ladders lashed together. They pushed through Camp 1, Camp 2, in the scorching solar oven heat of the western CWM, and up the steep blue ice face of the Lhotse Wall to Camp 3. During this grueling process, Krakauer's initial excitement gradually mutated into a deep, creeping unease. The physical toll was devastating. Coughs shattered ribs, dysentery sapped strength, the thin air left minds muddled and bodies lethargic. But more frightening than the physical degradation was Krakauer's realization of the group dynamics. His mountaineer's survival instinct, honed over decades in the wild, sensed a profound danger. The margin for error on Everest is non-existent, yet he was tied to a rope with people who did not know how to put on their crampons properly. The guides were exhausted from doing the work their clients could not do for themselves. Lives were essentially being placed in the hands of economic decisions rather than safety ones. Yet, in the midst of this fear, a transformation occurred. The shared suffering forged an unspoken bond. Krakauer watched as strangers cared for one another, sharing precious water and words of encouragement when lungs burned and morale plummeted. The paralyzing fear of the mountain began to turn into a fragile belief in the team. Instincts of self-preservation were altered through the sheer necessity of mutual reliance. By the time they retreated to base camp to rest before the final summit push, their bodies were battered, thin, and exhausted. But the result of this brutal initiation was an unshakable resolve. The game had truly begun. The financial sunk cost, The public expectations and the sheer human pride involved meant that no one was willing to turn back now. The circus was moving to the upper mountain, blindly marching toward a confrontation with a merciless sky.
The assault on the summit began in the pitch-black, freezing hours of midnight on May 10, 1996. The staging ground was Camp 4, perched precariously on the South Col, a desolate, windswept saddle of rock and ice at 26,000 feet. In this unforgiving atmospheric realm, known as the death zone, the human body begins a rapid process of dying. The air is so desperately thin that cells deteriorate, brain function slows to a sluggish crawl, and the simple act of putting on a pair of boots requires the effort of a marathon sprint.
As John Krakauer stepped out of his flapping nylon tent into the biting wind, he joined a disconcertingly large procession of headlamps bobbing up the blue ice face of the mountain. This was not a solitary communion with nature, it was a high-altitude traffic jam. Compounding the presence of Rob Hall's adventure consultants and Scott Fisher's Mountain Madness teams were two other deeply controversial expeditions that had decided to push for the summit on the exact same day. One was the Taiwanese national team, led by Makalu Gao. Gao was a stocky, ever-smiling man in his 40s, exuding a relentless, almost oblivious optimism. While he was a spirited leader, his team had a reputation on the mountain for being dangerously inexperienced and disorganized, lacking the fundamental alpine skills required for an 8,000-meter peak. The other was the South African team, led by Ian Woodall. Woodall, 39, was a former military man with sharp avian features and an abrasive, combative personality. He had alienated almost everyone at base camp with his paranoia, refusing to share radio frequencies or cooperate on fixing ropes. The sudden convergence of these disparate, highly varied groups created a terrifying bottleneck from the very first steps into the darkness. The climbing plan dictated a strict adherence to time. Rob Hall had repeatedly hammered a golden rule into his clients' oxygen-starved brains. 2 p.m. was the absolute turnaround time. It did not matter if you were 100 feet from the summit or just halfway up. If the clock struck 2, you turned around and descended. Survival depended on having enough daylight and bottled oxygen to navigate the treacherous terrain back to the tents. Every climber carried this desire, to reach the top and return alive. But as the hours ticked by, the cruel reality of Everest began to unravel their meticulous plans. By the time the climbers reached the balcony at 27,600 feet, the sun was rising, illuminating a catastrophic logistical failure. The Sherpas were supposed to have climbed ahead of the clients to fix safety ropes along the exposed, razor-sharp ridges. However, due to miscommunication and exhaustion, no ropes had been laid. The climbing leaders were forced to halt. Among the Sherpas was Ang Dorje, Hall's climbing sirdar. At 28, Ang Dorje was slight in build, but possessed iron-like endurance and a deeply spiritual Buddhist soul. Usually leading the charge, he was currently sitting in the snow, brooding and uncooperative, harboring deep resentment because the Mountain Madness Sherpas had not assisted him earlier. The most prominent Sherpa for Scott Fisher's team, Lopsang Jangbu, was in an even worse state. Lopsang was 23, handsome with a flashy gold tooth, fiercely loyal to Fisher, and widely considered the strongest native climber on the mountain. Yet, at the balcony, Lopsang was bent over, violently vomiting into the snow, completely drained of his superhuman strength. The reason for his exhaustion was a shocking display of commercial servitude. Lower down on the steep Lhotse face, Lopsang had taken it upon himself to short rope Sandy Hill pitmen. For several grueling hours, he had literally towed the wealthy, faltering New York socialite up the sheer ice using a 3-foot length of rope, dragging a 130-pound dead weight at an altitude where simply walking requires maximal effort. This Herculean, misguided task had shattered Lopsang just when the expedition desperately needed his strength to fix the lines ahead. The delay at the balcony cost them an hour, but the true nightmare materialized higher up at the Hillary Step. This intimidating 40-foot vertical spur of rock and ice is the final major obstacle before the summit. Here, the bottleneck became a lethal trap. Once again, there were no fixed ropes. Anatoly Bukrev, Fisher's premier guide, was forced to step in. Bukrev, 38, was a powerfully built Russian with a weathered, stoic face and a philosophy of high-altitude purism. He climbed without supplemental oxygen, a controversial choice that made him exceptionally strong, but sometimes detached from the immediate needs of the slower, weaker clients. Alongside guide Neil Beetleman, Bukrev painstakingly anchored the ropes. While they worked, nearly 30 climbers stacked up in a line, clinging to the exposed ridge. They were completely exposed to a bone-chilling wind chill of -100 degrees Fahrenheit. The agonizing weight gnawed at their extremities, inviting frostbite. More terrifyingly, as they stood idle in the freezing void, their bottled oxygen, calibrated for continuous upward movement, was slowly bleeding away into the thin air. During this freezing, breathless wait, a profound psychological shift occurred across the expedition. The immense financial investment, the months of grueling preparation, and the agonizing physical suffering began to warp their judgment. Rationality and adherence to the 2 p.m. rule dissolved. The desire to conquer the mountain completely overshadowed reason. Fear, which should have driven them down, transformed into a reckless, stubborn obsession. They believed, foolishly, that sheer willpower could outlast the unforgiving mechanics of high altitude. John Krakauer managed to bypass the worst of the traffic, pulling his exhausted body onto the highest point on Earth at exactly 1:17 p.m. The summit of Mount Everest offered no grand epiphany. Krakauer felt no joy, no triumphant ecstasy. He was simply a hollow shell of physical and mental exhaustion, his brain too starved of oxygen to process the magnitude of his achievement. He stayed just long enough to snap a few rushed photographs. As he turned to leave, he noticed something ominous. A thick blanket of wispy, anvil-topped clouds creeping swiftly up the valleys from the south. The atmosphere was changing rapidly, but his hypoxia-addled mind failed to register the catastrophic threat brewing below. Desperate to escape the death zone, Krakauer began his descent. But upon reaching the top of the Hillary step, his heart sank. The single fixed rope was occupied by a massive, slow-moving line of climbers, still pushing upward. He was trapped on the narrow ridge. For over an hour and a half, Krakauer sat freezing on the precarious ledge, watching in quiet terror as the needle on his oxygen gauge dropped closer and closer to zero. As Krakauer waited, trapped by the ascending crowd, the fatal knot was tied. The 2 p.m. deadline came and went, yet the line of climbers continued to struggle upward. Rob Hall, the famously cautious leader, inexplicably ignored his own absolute rule. Somewhere below the Hillary step, he was actively coaxing his client, Doug Hansen, who was moving at a sluggish, exhausted pace, toward the summit. It was past 3 p.m., and some clients were still pushing upward, even past 4 p.m. The discipline that was supposed to keep them alive had completely collapsed, laying the groundwork for a tragedy that would soon unfold in the gathering, darkening clouds.
The descent from the summit of Mount Everest quickly transformed from a grueling test of endurance into a desperate flight for survival as the afternoon wore on. When John Krakauer finally unclipped from the fixed ropes below the Hillary step, the sky had undergone a terrifying metamorphosis. The wispy, innocuous clouds he had noticed earlier had rapidly metastasized into a boiling, bruised anvil of dark thunderheads. This was not a localized squall. It was a violent, full-blown atmospheric eruption.
The temperature plummeted instantaneously, and a low, guttural roar began to echo across the ridges as hurricane-force winds slammed into the upper mountain. The oxygen-starved climbers, already pushing the absolute limits of human physiology, were now faced with an apocalyptic whiteout. At the south summit, a rocky prominence at 28,700 feet, the situation began to rapidly unravel due to the insidious effects of hypoxia. It was here that Krakauer encountered Andy Harris, a 31-year-old junior guide for the Adventure Consultants team. Harris, affectionately known as Harold, was a ruggedly handsome, perpetually cheerful New Zealander with a reputation for fierce loyalty and immense physical strength. However, the man Krakauer found hunched over the oxygen cache was a stranger. Harris was in the grips of severe hypoxic dementia, his oxygen-starved brain misfiring catastrophically. The guide was frantically rummaging through a pile of orange aluminum oxygen cylinders, violently twisting the regulators. When Krakauer, gasping for air, asked for a fresh bottle, Harris looked at him with wild, uncomprehending eyes and insisted that every single bottle at the South Summit was entirely empty. Krakauer, though muddled by the altitude himself, leaned down and checked the gauges. The bottles were full. They were heavy with life-saving gas. He tried to reason with Harris, pointing to the needles indicating maximum pressure, but the guide's mind was locked in a deadly delusion. Harris adamantly refused to believe the visual evidence, screaming over the wind that the cache was utterly depleted. This terrifying mix-up, born from severe oxygen deprivation, would have fatal consequences, causing many climbers descending behind them to hesitate, panicked by the false belief that they had no supplemental oxygen left to survive the storm. Realizing he could not break through Harris's delirium and desperately needing to descend before he froze to death, Krakauer strapped on a fresh bottle, leaving the confused guide behind on the ridge, assuming that as a strong professional, Harris would eventually snap out of it and follow. Krakauer plunged downward, plunging into a maelstrom of flying ice. The visibility dropped to absolute zero. The wind roared with the deafening shriek of a jet engine, whipping granular snow into his eyes and blinding him. The world was reduced to a terrifying, disorienting gray void, where up and down seemed to lose their meaning. As Krakauer stumbled towards the relative safety of Camp 4 on the South Col, he encountered a figure sliding down the steep ice above the camp. Through the blinding snow and his own failing cognition, Krakauer believed this heavily clothed, frost-covered climber to be Andy Harris. In reality, the man sliding down the ice was Martin Adams. Adams was a 47-year-old Wall Street trader and a client on the Mountain Madness team. He was a highly competitive, fiercely independent, and somewhat reserved man who had proven remarkably resilient on the mountain, though he was now completely exhausted and merely operating on autopilot. When Adams slid past and tumbled toward the tents, Krakauer watched him stand up and stagger toward the camp. Convinced he had just witnessed his friend and guide reach safety, Krakauer finally crawled into his own violently flapping tent, zipping the door shut against the hurricane. Later, he would report to the base camp radio that Andy Harris was safely down, a catastrophic case of mistaken identity caused by hypoxia and zero visibility. This error would haunt Krakauer for the rest of his life, as the real Andy Harris was still high on the mountain, lost in the storm. Meanwhile, the bottleneck at the Hillary Step had finally released a trickle of dying climbers into the teeth of the whiteout. High on the exposed ridge, the illusion of commercial safety evaporated instantly. The VIP clients, who had paid astronomical sums to be catered to, were violently stripped of their worldly status. They were reduced to frail, vulnerable creatures fighting for their next breath. The task of saving this fractured group fell to Neil Beidelman. Beidelman, a 36-year-old guide for Mountain Madness, was a tall, powerfully built aerospace engineer by trade. He possessed a deeply analytical mind, a quiet sense of profound responsibility, and a gentle demeanor that belied his immense physical strength. Beidelman realized with rising horror that the storm was not going to break, and the clients were running out of time. Beidelman desperately tried to herd the stragglers down the mountain, acting as a sheepdog in a blinding blizzard. Among his terrified flock was Beck Weathers, a 49-year-old pathologist from Texas. Weathers was a highly opinionated, verbose man who often masked his intense ambition with self-deprecating humor. Before the climb, he had undergone a radial keratotomy, an eye surgery that, unbeknownst to him, severely altered the shape of his corneas at extreme high altitude, rendering him completely blind as the sun went down. Now, Weathers was stumbling in the darkness, entirely dependent on the physical guidance of others. Also in the group was Yasuko Namba, a 47-year-old Japanese businesswoman. Namba was tiny, weighing barely 90 pounds, yet she possessed an iron will. Quiet and intensely focused, she was attempting to complete the 7 summits, the highest peaks on all 7 continents. But now, her diminutive frame was failing rapidly under the relentless assault of the sub-zero hurricane. As Beetleman's group staggered down to the flat, desolate expanse of the South Col, the storm reached its terrifying climax. The wind chill plummeted to 100 degrees below zero. The South Col is a broad, featureless saddle of rock and ice, and in a whiteout, it is utterly impossible to navigate. The group wandered blindly, leaning into the wind, their oxygen long gone, their limbs losing sensation as frostbite crystallized their flesh. They were trapped on a frozen plateau, searching desperately for the tents of Camp 4. Unbeknownst to them, they had wandered to the very edge of the Kangshung Face, an abyss that dropped thousands of feet into Tibet. They were mere hundreds of meters away from the warmth and safety of the camp, but in the blinding fury of the whiteout, it might as well have been on the moon. Realizing that any further movement would likely result in someone walking off the edge of the world, Beetleman made a desperate, agonizing decision. He halted the group and forced them to huddle together on an exposed patch of ice. The survival instincts that had previously driven them to push for the summit now shifted to a primal need for shared body heat. The overwhelming fear of imminent death shattered all remaining pride and interpersonal barriers. They piled on top of one another, guides and clients, Americans and Japanese, creating a desperate human knot against the raging blizzard. Beetleman, refusing to let the cold claim his charges, moved among them, screaming over the wind, shaking them and beating on their chests to keep them from drifting into the seductive, painless sleep of severe hypothermia. In the darkness, the howling wind drowned out their cries, isolating them in a frozen purgatory where keeping each other sane and awake was the only tether they had left to the world of the living. The hurricane-force winds that battered the South Col were merely the outer edges of the cataclysm. Higher up the mountain, near the 29,028-foot summit, the white fury was absolute and apocalyptic. At the top of the Hillary Step, the situation for the Adventure Consultants expedition had deteriorated past the point of rescue. Rob Hall, the meticulous and deeply responsible head guide, was trapped in the death zone with his client, Doug Hansen. Hansen, the humble postal worker who had pushed his body beyond all fathomable limits to reach the top, was now entirely devoid of energy and supplemental oxygen. He had collapsed, becoming a lifeless weight against the steep, icy ridge. Hall was faced with the most agonizing dilemma a mountaineer can encounter. The harsh, unspoken law of extreme altitude dictates that if a climber cannot move under their own power, they must be left behind so that others might live. Attempting a rescue in a hypoxic, freezing hurricane is tantamount to suicide. Every primal survival instinct screaming in Hall's brain urged him to abandon Hansen and descend immediately.
Yet his professional conscience, coupled with a profound, aching empathy for the man he had turned around the previous year, outright forbade it. The instinct to save himself gave way to an overwhelming sense of love and responsibility. Hall made the fateful decision to stay, anchoring himself beside Hansen as the temperature plummeted to 100 degrees below zero. He radioed base camp, his voice remarkably calm despite the surrounding terror, asking for oxygen and support, unaware that the mountain had already been sealed off by the storm.
Further down the ridge, near the area of the balcony, another tragedy was quietly unfolding in the blinding dark. Scott Fisher, the rugged, seemingly invincible leader of the Mountain Madness team, had finally succumbed to the insidious effects of extreme altitude. Fisher was suffering from a catastrophic combination of high-altitude pulmonary edema, HAPE, and high-altitude cerebral edema, HACE. His lungs were filling with fluid, drowning him from the inside, while his brain swelled against his skull, stripping away his motor skills and rationality. He had collapsed into the snow, repeatedly tearing off his heavy down gloves and unzipping his suit in the freezing hurricane. a paradoxical, delirious reaction to severe hypothermia. Beside him was his fiercely loyal climbing sirdar, Lobsang Jangbu. Lobsang, though severely weakened himself from his earlier efforts, desperately tried to drag Fisher down the mountain. He pulled, pleaded, and physically struggled to move his massive leader. But Fisher was completely spent. Through the haze of his failing mind, Fisher experienced a tragic, terrifying moment of clarity. He recognized that he was dying, and that keeping Lobsang tethered to him would only result in the young Sherpa's death. With a heartbreaking acceptance of his own mortality, Fisher ordered Lobsang to leave him behind and descend the mountain to save the others. Reluctantly, weeping into the biting wind, Lobsang unclipped from his friend and hero, leaving Fisher alone on a narrow ledge to fade into the endless white noise of the storm. As the night deepened into an unimaginable abyss of cold and suffering, an act of desperate, doomed heroism occurred somewhere in the roaring darkness between the camps. Andy Harris, the cheerful junior guide who had earlier been gripped by severe hypoxic dementia at the South Summit, suddenly realized the grave peril his leader and friend, Rob Hall, was in. Defying all logic and the basic human drive to seek shelter, Harris performed a final, staggering act of bravery. Driven by an unwavering loyalty, he took hold of a heavy oxygen tank, struggling with gear he had hauled from the Camp 4 area, and turned his back on the safety of the lower slopes. He climbed directly back into the eye of the hurricane, fighting his way up the treacherous, ice-slicked ridge in a desperate bid to deliver the life-saving gas to Hall and Hansen. He was last seen as a faint, struggling shadow against the swirling snow before the storm swallowed him completely. Andy Harris disappeared forever into the void, his incredible sacrifice leaving no trace but the tragic legend of his final ascent. When the pale, freezing dawn finally broke over the Himalayas, it brought no warmth, only a horrifying clarity to the devastation. The wind had slightly lessened, but the cold remained an absolute, physical force. High on the South Summit, Rob Hall had miraculously survived the night, shivering uncontrollably in a shallow snow trench. But he was alone. Sometime during the brutal, endless darkness, Doug Hansen had vanished. Whether the exhausted postal worker had quietly succumbed to the cold and slipped off the precipitous edge, or whether he had tried to move and fallen thousands of feet down the sheer Kangshung face, Hall did not know. Hall himself was now severely crippled. His hands and legs were frozen solid, resembling blocks of wood, entirely useless. He was physically incapable of manipulating the fixed ropes, or even standing up. Yet, incredibly, his radio still functioned. He managed to make contact with base camp, his voice slurred and weak, reporting his paralysis. The base camp operators, engulfed in a state of helpless despair, realized they could not send anyone up in time. In a desperate, heartbreaking attempt to bring some comfort to the dying guide, they patched his radio frequency through a satellite phone directly to his home. Down at sea level, in the quiet, green city of Christchurch, New Zealand, Jan Arnold was jolted awake by the shrill ring of the telephone. Jan, in her mid-30s, was a formidable woman, both in intellect and physical endurance. A practicing physician with a lean, athletic build and practical, short-cropped hair, she was no stranger to the merciless realities of high altitude. Having successfully summited Everest alongside her husband, Rob Hall, in a previous expedition, she possessed a clinical, unflappable demeanor that made her an exceptional mountaineer and a grounding force in Hall's life. But now, 7 months pregnant with their first child, her usual pragmatic calm was being tested by the ultimate nightmare. As she held the receiver to her ear, the static-laced voice of her husband crackled through the satellite connection, bridging the vast, terrifying distance between a warm home and the frozen edge of the stratosphere. Jan knew the medical reality of frostbite and hypoxia at 28,700 feet. She knew, with the cold precision of a doctor and the shattered heart of a wife, that her husband was not coming home. Despite the agonizing pain and the encroaching shadow of death, Rob Hall's final thoughts were solely focused on protecting her from the horror of his reality. His voice, fading away in the thin air, carried a gentle, tragic serenity. "Sleep well, my sweetheart," he murmured into the radio, the transmission breaking through the howling wind one last time. "Please don't worry too much." With those words, the radio clicked off, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and colder than the mountain itself.
The dawn of May 11th broke over the Himalayas with a cruel, mocking brilliance. The violent hurricane that had terrorized the high reaches of Mount Everest throughout the night finally began to subside, leaving behind a sky of crystalline, piercing blue. However, the cessation of the wind brought no relief to the survivors huddled inside the shredded, flapping tents of Camp 4 on the South Col. The brutal light of day only served to illuminate the sheer, unfathomable scale of the catastrophe.
John Krakauer, shivering uncontrollably inside his sleeping bag, awoke to a reality far more terrifying than any nightmare. His body was ravaged by the extreme altitude. Every breath was a ragged gasp. His ribs ached from violent coughing fits, and his hypoxic brain struggled to process the horrific news echoing across the camp. The commercial expeditions, once symbols of wealthy adventurism and organized precision, had been utterly decimated. Guides were dead or missing, clients were scattered across the frozen wasteland, and the imperative had abruptly shifted from conquering the summit to executing a desperate, chaotic retreat. The agonizing responsibility of leading this retreat and accounting for the lost fell upon the battered remnants of the teams, pushing ordinary men to the absolute limits of their physical and moral endurance. The survival of several clients during the darkest hours of the storm was owed entirely to the staggering heroism of Anatoly Bukrev. A 38-year-old native of the Ural Mountains, Anatoly was a man sculpted from iron and ice. He possessed a barrel-chested, deeply muscular physique and a stoic, weathered face that rarely betrayed emotion, reflecting the grueling, highly competitive Soviet mountaineering system that had forged him. His personality was often perceived as aloof, solitary, or brutally pragmatic by Western clients, as he believed heavily in self-reliance over hand-holding. Most notably, he was a purist who adamantly refused to use supplemental oxygen while guiding. This was a decision that Krakauer fiercely debated and criticized in his accounts, arguing that climbing without gas dangerously compromised a guide's cognitive abilities and capacity to assist struggling clients. Yet, when the hurricane struck, and the oxygen-starved clients were hopelessly pinned down on the col, it was Bukrev's raw, unassisted power that miraculously tipped the scales. While others huddled paralyzed in the freezing dark, completely spent, Anatoly had plunged single-handedly back into the roaring whiteout. Operating on pure adrenaline and sheer alpine mastery, he risked his life multiple times, navigating the featureless void to drag 3 stranded climbers, Sandy Pittman, Charlotte Fox, and Tim Madsen, back to the warmth of the tents. He was a complex figure, flawed in his commercial guiding philosophy perhaps, but undeniably a savior when the mountain demanded superhuman endurance. However, even Bukrev could not carry everyone. 2 members of that huddled mass, Yasuko Namba and Beck Weathers, had been left behind in the dark, buried under the drifting snow. With Rob Hall trapped near the summit and Scott Fisher dead on the ridge, the de facto leadership of the shattered adventure consultants team fell to Dr. Stuart Hutchinson. A 34-year-old Canadian cardiologist, Hutchinson was a man of science and sharp intellect, characterized by a slight, wiry build and a serious, deeply analytical demeanor. He was not the most experienced climber on the mountain, but as the dawn broke, he was the least physically incapacitated of the remaining clients. Possessing a pragmatic mind unclouded by panic, Hutchinson recognized that time was running out for anyone still exposed to the elements. He immediately rallied a group of Sherpas to scour the vast, frozen expanse of the South Col for Weathers and Namba. Fighting through the biting cold and knee-deep drifts, the search party eventually located the 2 missing climbers near the terrifying precipice of the Kangshung Face. The sight that greeted Hutchinson was the embodiment of high-altitude horror. Yasuko Namba, the 47-year-old Japanese businesswoman, was a heartbreaking spectacle. Barely 90 pounds in peak health, she was a quiet, intensely focused woman whose entire being had been dedicated to becoming the oldest woman to conquer the 7 summits. Now she lay partially buried in a depression of ice, her diminutive frame encased in a thick carapace of frost. One of her heavy-down gloves was missing, leaving her bare hand exposed, looking as pale and fragile as porcelain. Beside her lay Beck Weathers. The 49-year-old Texas pathologist was usually a verbose, highly opinionated man who masked his fierce ambition and intense drive with a thick, protective layer of self-deprecating Southern humor. Before the expedition, he had undergone radial keratotomy, an eye surgery that inadvertently severely altered the shape of his corneas under extreme atmospheric pressure, rendering him completely blind as the altitude increased. Now, his jacket was blown open to the freezing wind, his face caked in a solid mask of ice, his limbs contorted awkwardly in the snow. Hutchinson knelt in the freezing gale, his medical training kicking in, confronting the cruelest reality of disaster medicine, the necessity of triage. In a mass casualty situation at 26,000 feet, with zero medical infrastructure, no rescue helicopters, and critically exhausted personnel, one must abandon the dying to save the living. Hutchinson carefully examined both climbers. Their pupils were fixed and dilated. They were entirely unresponsive to pain or sound, and their breathing was imperceptible. Believing with absolute medical certainty that they were beyond any hope of resuscitation, Hutchinson made the agonizing, haunting decision to leave them on the ice. The team returned to Camp 4, burdened by the terrible knowledge that they were leaving their friends to die, focusing their rapidly dwindling energy on preparing the walking wounded for the perilous descent. Hours passed in a haze of grief and logistical scrambling. The radios crackled with grim reports, and the tragedy rippled outwards across the globe. Back in Dallas, Texas, the expedition organizers had already made the devastating phone call. Beck Weathers' wife, Peach, had been officially notified that her husband had perished on the mountain, a death notice delivered while his body still lay on the high glacier. The surviving members at Camp 4 were zipping their packs, their minds heavy with survivor's guilt, readying themselves to abandon the South Col. But the human spirit, driven by subconscious anchors of love, possesses an unfathomable, almost terrifying resilience. Out on the desolate, sun-bleached expanse of the Col, a biological miracle was occurring. The afternoon sun, though incredibly weak through the thin atmosphere, provided just enough radiant heat to thaw the ice sealing Weathers' eyes. Left for dead not once, but twice, Beck awoke from a deep, profound hypothermic coma. He was completely blind. His right arm was frozen completely solid, sticking out awkwardly from his side, stiff as a wooden log. His face was grotesquely blackened by severe necrotic frostbite, resembling a mummified corpse. Yet, in the depths of his failing consciousness, a vivid, powerful hallucination of his wife and children materialized, sparking a primal, overwhelming drive to return to them. He knew instinctively that if he closed his eyes again, he would die. Like a ghost rising from a frozen grave, Beck staggered to his feet. Driven by pure subconscious longing and an absolute refusal to surrender, he began to blindly shamble toward the vague, multicolored shapes of Camp 4. When the survivors saw the monstrous, frost-blackened figure lurching into camp with its arm raised in a macabre, stiff salute, a wave of stunned, paralyzed disbelief washed over the tents. Krakauer and the others stared in shock before springing into action, rushing forward to drag the severely crippled Texan out of the wind. They hauled him into a tent, frantically trying to thaw his frozen limbs with hot water bottles and wrapping him in multiple sleeping bags. The sheer impossibility of Weathers' survival shattered all preconceived notions of human physiological limits. He had survived a night in the open that had killed men far stronger than him. However, his miraculous resurrection also added a massive, complex logistical burden to a team that was already operating on the ragged edge of total collapse. The painful, arduous retreat down the precipitous Lhotse face would now include a man who was blind, missing portions of his face, and teetering on the very edge of death. The storm had passed, but the grueling toll of the mountain demanded that the survivors navigate the treacherous icefall and steep faces not as conquerors, but as a battered, traumatized procession fleeing the wrath of the Mother Goddess, forever changed by the horrors they had witnessed and the miracles they had endured.
The descent from the high Himalaya back to the suffocatingly thick air of sea level was a jarring, surreal transition. When John Krakauer finally boarded a plane in Kathmandu and touched down in Seattle, the civilized world felt alien and garish. He had survived the deadliest season in the history of Mount Everest, but the man who returned was fundamentally fractured. At the airport, he was embraced by his wife, Linda Krakauer. In her early 40s, Linda was a slender, deeply pragmatic woman with kind, observant eyes and a quiet, unyielding strength.
A former climber herself, she intimately understood the intoxicating allure of the high peaks. But her personality was firmly rooted in the practical, grounding realities of everyday life. She was a woman who valued stability and honest connection. However, the husband she held in her arms felt like a hollow shell. John was physically emaciated, his ribs protruding against his skin after losing nearly 20 pounds of muscle and fat. But his psychological starvation was far more profound. He was tethered to the living world by Linda's patient care, yet his mind was perpetually trapped in a howling -70-degree whiteout, replaying the catastrophic errors of May 10th over and over again. Driven by a desperate, almost manic desire to find the answer to the haunting question of why, Krakauer immediately threw himself into writing the assigned article for Outside magazine. He hoped that by painstakingly reconstructing the timeline of the disaster, he could untangle the knot of terrible decisions and find some semblance of peace of mind. The article was written in a frantic, blood-letting blur of trauma and exhaustion. But a magazine feature was not enough. The complexities of the tragedy demanded the expansive, unforgiving canvas of a book. As Krakauer transitioned the article into the manuscript for Into Thin Air, the ethical debates surrounding the disaster ignited. His meticulous exposure of the truth, the hubris, the commercial pressures, the fatal misjudgments, inevitably touched the raw, bleeding nerves of many victims' families. The mountaineering community became fractured. Krakauer found himself at the center of a storm of controversy, heavily burdened by the crushing weight of survivors' guilt. He lay awake at night, tormented by a singular, agonizing realization. Did his very presence as an embedded journalist inadvertently pressure Rob Hall? Hall, fiercely protective of his flawless guiding record, was acutely aware that a writer from a major publication was evaluating his every move. Krakauer agonized over whether his notebook and camera had served as an invisible catalyst, subtly pushing Hall to ignore his own absolute turnaround time to ensure a successful, highly publicized summit for his clients. The most devastating manifestation of Krakauer's survivor's guilt involved the agonizing correspondence with the family of Andy Harris. Following the publication of the initial magazine article, Krakauer was forced to confront Fiona McPherson, Andy's partner. Fiona was a tall, athletic New Zealand physician with striking features, a brilliant medical mind, and a fiercely loving, fiercely protective personality. She was navigating an ocean of grief with stoic grace, desperately seeking any factual fragment about the final hours of the man she loved. In his initial reporting, Krakauer had provided Fiona with a comforting narrative. He told her that he had personally seen Andy reach the safety of Camp 4, implying that whatever happened next was a tragic accident near the tents. However, weeks later, through further interviews and the lifting of his own hypoxic fog, Krakauer realized with horrifying clarity that he had suffered a severe altitude-induced hallucination. The man he had seen sliding down the ice into camp was not Andy Harris. It was Martin Adams. Andy Harris had never made it down. He had heroically climbed back up into the hurricane to save Rob Hall and Doug Hansen, and had subsequently vanished. Having to write to Fiona and Andy's parents to retract his initial story, to strip away the false comfort he had mistakenly provided, was the most difficult and sickening task of Krakauer's life. The remorse tore at his soul. He had accidentally mangled the truth of a dying man's final moments due to his own brain's oxygen starvation, inflicting a secondary, unhealable wound upon a grieving family. Through this agonizing process of reflection and investigation, a profound and permanent change occurred within Krakauer. The towering majesty of Mount Everest was entirely stripped of its wild romance. It was no longer a symbol of transcendent human endeavor or spiritual awakening. It had been revealed as a cold, unforgiving tomb of ambition. The commercialization of the mountain had created a deadly illusion of safety, convincing wealthy amateurs that the mother goddess of the earth could be tamed with fixed ropes, bottled oxygen, and a $65,000 check. Krakauer saw with terrifying clarity that the mountain itself harbored no malice. It simply existed in a state of violent, indifferent atmospheric physics. It was human greed, the inflation of the ego, and the hubris of the commercial guiding industry that had led lambs to the slaughter. This grim reality was forever immortalized by the macabre state of the mountain itself. Mount Everest does not yield its dead. The extreme cold, the sheer altitude, and the treacherous terrain make the recovery of bodies virtually impossible without risking further lives. Consequently, the fallen members of the 1996 expeditions were left where they perished, their bodies flash-frozen into permanent fixtures of the landscape. Scott Fischer's body remained on a rocky ledge, his jacket faded by the harsh ultraviolet light. Yasuko Namba lay frozen into the South Col, a diminutive shape under the drifting snow. Rob Hall's frozen form remained near the south summit, a silent sentinel in the death zone. These individuals, once vibrant, ambitious souls, were tragically reduced to morbid waypoints. They became cruel, unavoidable landmarks for future climbing groups. Climbers stepping over their frozen boots in the years to come would be forced to look upon the ultimate price of hubris. In the end, Into Thin Air emerged not just as a piece of investigative journalism, but as a timeless cautionary tale. It stands as a dark monument to the fragility of human life when pitted against the raw, unbridled forces of nature. Krakauer's grueling journey from the summit of Everest to the depths of his own psychological trauma serves as a stark warning to anyone who gazes upon the high peaks with a sense of entitlement. The mountain cannot be bought, it cannot be reasoned with, and it certainly cannot be conquered. The tragic events of May 1996 proved unequivocally that Everest is not an amusement park. It is a sacred, highly lethal environment where the margin for error is zero, and where the relentless pursuit of commercial glory is ultimately paid for in human lives, leaving those who survive to carry the unhealable wounds forever.
As the embers of our campfire burn down to a soft glow, I want you to take a deep breath with me. The freezing winds of Everest are far away now, but the echoes of that mountain still carry a gentle whisper for our everyday lives. We all have our own mountains to climb. It might be a career goal, a financial dream, or a personal ambition. Sometimes we get so fixated on reaching the summit that we ignore the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. We push past our limits, driven by ego, pride, or the fear of losing what we have already invested. But the truest courage is not always blindly pushing forward. It is having the wisdom and the humility to know when to turn back. The top of the mountain is only the halfway point of the journey. Real success is making it back down safely to the warmth of the people who love us and wait for us at home. May God bless the souls of Rob Hall, Scott Fischer, Andy Harris, Doug Hansen, Yasuko Namba, and all the brave spirits who rest eternally in the cold snow. May God also bless each and every one of you listening today, guiding your steps and keeping you safe through the sudden storms of your own lives.
If this journey brought you a moment of reflection, please share this story with your friends and subscribe to the channel so we can sit by this fire together again. I kindly invite you to leave a comment typing the word Amen to honor those who fell on the highest peak and to pray for peace, wisdom, and safety for us all. Thank you for walking this path with me.